Good evening, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on European history, and today we are talking about the iconic transition debate which ensued between historians in order to understand this critical phase of transition from feudalism to capitalism in European history. When we talk of this transition from feudalism to capitalism, essentially we are talking of say the times between 13th, 14th, 15th and 16th centuries in Europe, and this is the time when the earlier way of life or you can say mode of production gave way to a new mode of life and mode of production that we understand as capitalism. So in an earlier interaction that I had with you, I have given you the broad overview of this transition debate. We have outlined the basic argumental difference between the group of historians, and in today's lecture we would be tracking the details of those contours that we had already drawn in our earlier lecture. So just to give you some kind of a glimpse of the outline of this debate, essentially there are 2-3 points which we will quickly just rush through in order to encapsulate what we have earlier discussed. Number one, when we say transition from feudalism to capitalism, let's understand that feudalism as a concept is a modern construct, and after trying to study the contemporary society, we started making a contrast with the earlier way of life or past, and then we realized that we cannot treat the Roman way of life or the classical Greek period or the Pax Romana period up to the emergence of modernity, say from around 16th century or 15th century or so, from Renaissance period and so forth, as uninterrupted kind of unified piece of history. So there arose a need to segregate what we understand as the ancient regime or what we understand as the classical Greco-Roman empire and so forth with what happened on account of Germanic invasion in different parts of Europe and Muslim incursion subsequently giving a different kind of you can say mode of production to European society. So we have spoken about it in our earlier interaction in terms of inventing a term like feudalism to understand this change. So it is in the modern times that we started writing about medieval period to be understood with the conceptual term of feudalism. So in the early decades of the 20th century, we have Maurice Dobbs' famous studies in the development of capitalism, which was written in the first quarter of the 20th century, where he goes on to elaborate the Marxist point of view. And when we say Marxist point of view, what essentially we are meaning here is that he went on to locate the causal factor of this transition from feudalism to capitalism in factors that were internal to the feudal system. So the cracks had developed not on account of some extraneous factor like emergence of towns which are not part of feudal formation, or trade and commerce which are not to be seen very much operative in the feudal times, rather in terms of intensification of feudal oppression leading to migration of peasants from their fields to nearby towns as some kind of escape and so forth. Whereas we have Paul Sweezy, who alongside Henri Perrin, of course, which we have spoken of in our last interaction. In the 1950s, we have Sweezy, who challenged this through his writings in the Journal of Science and Society. Thereafter, in the 1970s, we have Immanuel Wallerstein's book, The Origins of the Modern World System, which appeared in 2 volumes, 1 and 2, which dealt with this issue of transition, and he had important postulations to make for this transition debate. Then we have Perry Anderson's 2 books, Passages from Antiquity to Feudalism and Lineages of the Absolutist State, which dealt with the concept of feudalism in a rather detailed way. And finally, we have Brenner's 3 articles, which renewed the debate in the 1970s about this transition. And of course, even subsequent to that, we will see we have interventions by Takahashi and so forth, and there are several Annal scholars also who have taken up the issue of demography, and demography being responsible for this change. Neo-Malthusian models have also been deployed in order to make sense of this transition in terms of what triggered this transition from feudalism to capitalism. Now, the central issue of this debate was if feudalism dissolved on account of external factors, if that was an issue, or if trade, commerce, etc. were regarded as outside feudalism, they were not counted in the feudal way of life. So, if you regard trade and commerce as external factors, then from where did these factors come in and how it actually happened? So, that is what is at the center of this debate. Now, if you read Maurice Dobb, Rodney Hilton or Christopher Hill, then they would rather account for the feudal dissolution more due to the internal contradiction rather than some external factor like trade and commerce. So, as opposed to the Parenian thesis, where trade and feudalism are regarded as dichotomous, as regarded as antagonistic. So, if there is intensification of trade, feudalism will go. Feudalism can't thrive where trade is also there, and if trade vanishes, trade and commerce vanishes, then it gives rise to a kind of ruralized, localized economy, which is a very fertile ground for the emergence of feudalism. And this is how Henri Perrine tried to view this transition from feudalism to capitalism. So, he regards coming of the towns and emergence of cities by around 13th century, 14th century in Europe as critical to this transition from feudalism to capitalism, because these towns and cities actually worked as some kind of a magnet for the tenurial relation bound peasants to flee from their areas, go to nearby cities where they could earn their livelihood through wages, through salaries. So, this was a kind of emancipation for them. And therefore, Perrine would rather view that it is the coming of the cities, it is the intensification of trade and commerce, which was critical to dissolution of feudalism, whereas Dobb, Rodney Hilton, Christopher Hill would not agree with Perrine and look for the causal factor in factors that are internal to feudal system. So, it is as a result of some kind of a contradictory cracks that developed in the feudal mode of production, which resulted in its dissolution. So, they argued that wars, luxury consumption or conspicuous consumption as we know it, or ever increasing taxes that were incident on the peasants in the feudal times actually pushed the feudal oppression to a point of being unbearable. So, it is not on account of the charm of the nearby towns and cities that emerged in the 13th, 14th centuries in Europe. Rather, it is on account of the ever increasing feudal exactions that were incident on the farmers or the peasants or the serfs, which led them to move away from the farms to the cities, and that brought down the entire edifice of feudal structure. So, Dobb and others would argue that this situation eventually led to a formation of bipolar society into feudal lords and the peasants. And once you have polarization, social polarization or economic polarization as such into binary categories, it becomes it fits into the Marxist way of analysis, that is new mode of production resulting from the class struggle of two opposite groups, two antagonistic groups, the feudal lords and the peasants. So, the feudal lords and the peasants fought and therefore, feudal system went away and a new capitalist system emerged. Trade, which of course was regarded as an external factor according to them, only added fuel to the already simmering discontent or contradiction in the small scale enterprise. So, as one can very easily see that they cannot or Dobb and others would not altogether dismiss the role of trade and commerce, but would just accord a peripheral role to them, and would say that the contradiction was basic and internal to feudalism, and emergence of towns and cities around this time only added some kind of a fuel to the already simmering dissent or contradiction in the existing feudal way of life. Therefore, not much emphasis on trade is laid by these historians as a responsible factor for feudal decline. So, if you look at the range of arguments that we come across, one way of classifying could be Marxist and non-Marxists. So, if you concentrate on the arguments of Marxist scholars, Maurice Dobb is one, you discover that Marxists tend to emphasize on the class conflict as the responsible factor for bringing about this transition from feudalism to capitalism, whereas the non-Marxist scholars would rather describe more, and they would not fall into the trap of defining as to what is feudalism, what is capitalism, and so forth, right. So, that is the Marxist way of doing history, where there is that implicit sense of teleology, where the entire human history has to go in one unidirectional way and reach a point. And telos in Marxist writing is communism, right? And the stages of human progression or social progression from primitive communism to slavery, from slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, and eventually the would-be socialism or communism. So, things have to fit into this scheme, and therefore, class conflict becomes an emphasized point in the writings of Marxist scholars, whereas the non-Marxists would describe things without any compulsion of organizing entire historical data in terms of bipolar class struggle. So, in non-Marxist writings, you will find that they focus more on intra-class relations instead of inter-class, because class struggle is not the category of analysis for non-Marxist scholars. So, they do not have to weave every data into this binary of class struggle in order to understand any change. Similarly, non-Marxists would, if you read them, you will find that they detail the organization of work or fiefs more than the Marxist scholars. They emphasize the military aspect of feudalism more than the Marxists. So, that is one way of looking at things. Whereas, as I have spoken of this in my earlier interaction also, if you look at it from the historian's point of view, the two major schools, Sweezy and others on one side, and Morris Dobb followed by several others on the other side. So that's yet another way to understand the range of arguments related to the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Now, Paul Sweezy would say, because he subscribes to the idea of trade and commerce being responsible, quite like Henri Parain, who had argued of the dichotomy between feudalism and trade. So Sweezy would regard cities having triggered 4 important changes, and it is indisputable that from around 13th, 14th centuries we have some kind of a revival of cities and grand trade in European context. So of those 4 important changes triggered by the emergence of cities in these 2 centuries, one is specialization of labor and production unit in the milieu of exchange economy. So once cities come, cities by definition is settlement of non-agrarian population, and in order to survive, in order to ensure their survival, of course they have to procure food grains from nearby areas or from distant areas in order to sustain themselves. So the sheer emergence of cities in different parts of Europe would presuppose hinterland, rural hinterland in the vicinity, in the nearby areas from where food was procured, and the sheer fact that for something as essential as food grains, they have to procure it from somewhere. So transportation mechanism would be there, storage mechanism would be there, market mechanism would be there in order to ensure that the food grains are transacted with something else that the urban dwellers have, right. So currency, coinage, etc. also come into focus. So once you have emergence of trade and once you have emergence of cities and towns in different parts of Europe, you can presuppose that there is, or there must have already been, some intensification in market, in coinage, in all kinds of transactional activities, including communication. So it is an exchange economy that we are talking of, and the production unit is now not the fief of a feudal lord or the feudal demesne. Rather, it could be something else in these towns. It could be small artisanal activity, it could be manufacturing activity on a different scale, different from the farm production, right. So cities would trigger this change as one important change. Now, what's the second thing that Sweezy is talking about is that producers are now pursuing, on account of emergence of towns, producers are now pursuing wealth and not manorial customs. Hence, there is a scope for technological change. So quite unlike manorial customs, which defined the way of life for feudal times, now these producers are no more pursuing the manorial customs, rather they are pursuing wealth. And in order to maximize wealth, it is very likely that there would be a corresponding technological change, and that is critical to the emergence of capitalism. Then Sweezy goes on to say, as the third point on account of emergence of towns and cities, is that there is a corresponding expansion of consumers and consumer goods because of trade, which is very self-evident, so I am not going to elaborate this. And then, of course, towns would emerge as centers of freedom and exchange. Why freedom? Because on account of the manorial customs, the serfs in feudal areas would just not be able to earn anything like wages or salaries, but if they come to the towns, they can sell their labor. So labor becomes a commodity for them, and by selling their labor they earn something, and by that earning they can buy something. So exchange economy gets intensified and the agrarian labor, which was earlier part of serfdom, had no experience of freedom, now are free to buy anything that they have earned out of their sale of labor. So that is what freedom here means in terms of emergence of trade, emergence of towns and cities. Whereas point by point, let's see what Maurice Dobb has to critique so far as Sweezy's assertions are concerned. So when Sweezy says that towns and cities led to a specialization of labor and production unit in the milieu of exchange economy, Dobb would remind us of the fact that, well, whatever be the merit of this, not more than 10% of the population in the 13th to 15th centuries actually lived in these cities. So he reminds us of the fact that we should not be mindful of the scale or the degree of argument that we are making. So does it have enough wherewithal for 10% of population living in cities to completely overhaul centuries old customary system of feudalism? So that is where he puts the question mark. Dobb further goes on to remind us of the scale of trade, capital and investment in these couple of centuries, that is 13th to 15th centuries, and say that the scale of trade and capital was very limited, and to mount on this scale of trade and capital the responsibility of changing the entire system from feudalism to capitalism is rather labored. That is what Dobb would ask us to believe. Similarly, he goes on to say that, well, wages in cities and towns were certainly high, all right, but so was the expenditure in cities. So it was costly to live in cities, and therefore this agrarian labor that had migrated from feudal scenario to the free environment of the cities actually had very little in terms of capital that they could invest in other pursuits. So they had very little saving, and to make a case out of this as big as being responsible for the transition from feudalism to capitalism, Dobb would say that it is somewhat far-fetched. Then as a critique to Sweezy's assertion of towns as centers of freedom and exchange, Dobb reminds us of the continued presence of guilds which had a constraining presence in the city. So guilds were a traditional organization, and it was not tuned to individualized pursuits of enterprise and free market and so forth, and guilds were very much there in the mainstream of the European city life, so particularly for artisans and several other manufacturing activities or traders and so forth. And they were pre-modern organizations who would rather emphasize other community issues, and their lines of functioning was not tuned to individualized profit making and so forth, or capital building and so forth. So this argument that Sweezy makes with reference to freedom and exchange and locates the site as these cities is somewhat cut into by Dobb through his argument. Similarly, there have been writings that have emphasized the role of the state in process of this transition. Notion that despotic rule was pro-feudal and absence of despotic rule therefore resulted in capitalism. And generally the example that is cited is that of the Netherlands. We know of Antwerp, Amsterdam as the iconic cities that emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, marking the shift of economy, European economy from Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and the sheer fact that in the Netherlands or the Low Countries we did not have despotic rule. So some historians say that, well, this is the factor, or this could be the factor, that if you had despotic rule in an area, the chances of this transition was minimized. Similarly, we have Perry Anderson, who feels that state actually tilted whatever state or absolutist states that were emerging in around 16th century, they tilted towards the nobility or the bourgeoisie as per its strength. There is no specific grammar of absolutist monarchies. So, depending on the local situation, whatever could provide a better power base, they would tilt towards that. Then some historians have spoken of the Roman law in the matters of absolute monarchies, which buttress the idea of private property. All of us know as to how Roman law actually spoke of king being in command and how it buttressed the idea of private property. So that has also been written about. Mark Bloch, who I refer to as having begun the Annales school of history writing in the 1920s, studied the he brought in a fresh gush of explanation, and he studied the dimensions of behavior which were not influenced by production aspects. So he would rather study food habits, popular culture, etc. And therefore, in his 2-volume Feudal Society, the books that he wrote, he broadened the sphere of feudal analysis. His emphasis was not on definition of feudalism, but its discussion. Instead of the Roman perception of feudalism in terms of military organization, fiefs, and baronial knights, Bloch held subject peasantry, use of service tenants instead of salary, supremacy of class of warriors, ties of obedience, protection or vassalage as the fundamental features of feudalism. The Marxist historians, on the other hand, regarded feudalism as a political social or a politico-social order that was appropriate to natural economy, in which land is the main source of income and the only embodiment of wealth. Further than that, we have Rodney Hilton, for whom the basic feature of feudalism was its agrarian character and petty production based on peasant family. However, the surplus production was appropriated by a class of landlords who did not fulfill the economic functions. So, this is a way in which different Marxist scholars have looked at feudalism, whereas Takahashi, who criticizes Dobb and Sweezy for beginning their works with the conceptual definition of feudalism and capitalism, goes on to say, Takahashi says, that the contradictions between the two are not in terms of system based on production of use and production for exchange, but between feudal land relations, that is serfdom, where labor is not a commodity, and industrial capital, where wage labor is there or labor works as a commodity and industrial capital happens to be a product of that labor. We have just spoken about it, the binary between the two. Then we have Rodney Hilton, who emphasizes on political, judicial and cultural aspects of feudalism. Vassalage, therefore, is the central theme of analysis in Hilton's writings. Peasant consciousness and freedom, and therefore peasant consciousness and freedom, and therefore the 14th century marks for Hilton a period of great change. Robert Brenner emphasized the class struggle and class exploitation as the prime mover of feudal society. He therefore contrasts the French and English experience as in the process of transition. So, it is about consciousness as well, and if you don't have consciousness, class consciousness, then capitalism would not have resulted just on account of the existence of the objective conditions of feudalism. Neo-Malthusian demographic model have also been emphasized by historians like Lee Roy Laduri and M. Poston, and they use a long-term perspective of gradual, imperceptive yet definite change as some kind of a system that is juxtaposed to economic system with a built-in mechanism of self-correction. So, it is black deaths and so forth, the associated consequences of black deaths leading to depopulation and hence stress on the feudal economy and wages and so forth. So, this is how the debate of transition from feudalism to capitalism is studied by different historians, and on these contours we have just through this lecture tried to understand the details and substance of this debate. Thank you.